Hi everyone, my name is Katrina Walser from Oliphant and I'm a knitting teacher and designer based in Sydney in Australia. And welcome to my monthly podcast on the needles. So this is a knitting podcast. It's episode 21 and it's currently June of 2023. So this is a roundup of everything I got up to in May. So before we begin, in the spirit of reconciliation, I would like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land on which I stand, the Darug people. Pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. So like I mentioned, this is a wrap-up of everything I got done in May, and finally there is actually a bit to talk about. So if you are a returning viewer, you'll know that I've been struggling a bit for the last couple of months. So thankfully, I've gotten a bit of my mojo back. And if you are a new viewer, then welcome. I'm glad you're here. Don't know how you found me, but I'm glad that you have. Hopefully you enjoy yourself. Grab yourself a cup of coffee or a tea or something stronger if you want, and come sit and knit with me for a while. We usually talk about my whips and FOs, and then also some random life stuff, just whatever I feel like talking about, and then as well as what's coming up next. Aside from being a knitter, like I mentioned, I am a designer, so we do also end up talking a little bit about designs and where inspiration from patterns and stuff, for patterns and stuff comes from. So hopefully that's a little bit interesting as well. If you're looking for me elsewhere on the internet, I am Oliphant Cat on Instagram, and also on Ko-fi. Thank you for everyone who's bought me a coffee last month. I do really appreciate it. And thank you for supporting me and the podcast. And there's a link down below to where you can find me, as well as the Instagram and the Ko-fi. There's also a newsletter that I send out. If you sign up, then there is a free beanie pattern that'll come your way. And there is meant to be a monthly newsletter. It hasn't happened for the last several months. So if you have signed up previously and you're wondering where the newsletter's gone, it's not your fault. It hasn't gone into your spam. It just hasn't been sent out. This month. I will do it this month. And if you're looking for me on Ravelry, there's a link down below too to my profile and my designs. Okay, so I think that's enough yammering on. Guess we'll just get started. So the first section of my podcast is always on the needles, which is where I talk about all of my whips and FOs. So the first thing to talk about is what I'm wearing. This is not a new FO at all. This was made in, I think, 2021. The pattern is called Carbeth. It is by Kate Davies. And I knit it with 2 strands of 8-ply yarn held together. They are both from Bendigo Woolen Mills. One was called Tweed. It's unfortunately discontinued now. And the other one is their luxury yarn, which is pretty staple yarn from BWM. And so that's definitely still on sale. If you are looking for links to any of the patterns or the yarns that I mentioned, I will also put links to those down below as well. Now, I love this jumper. As soon as it rolls around to like May, I start looking for excuses to wear it. It is thick enough that I can wear it as the outer layer because Sydney doesn't get too cold. So even in the winter in like June and July, I can usually get away with wearing it as the outermost layer without needing like a coat or anything on top of it. And so that's great because I have a lot of dresses and high-waisted skirts that I like to wear in the winter just over some tights. And so it's a perfect complement to that. I just throw it on top and it works out really nicely. I like it enough that I keep thinking I should make another jumper like this. I have another jumper's quantity worth of 8-ply yarn in a different base from a completely different company that has been looking for a project for years. And so I keep looking up very cropped, very thick, high-collared jumpers that I can make as well. And I think I've come to the conclusion that I should just make another one of these. I just haven't found anything that I like as much as it. It's so versatile because it's got enough detail that's interesting, but it's mostly plain. And so I'm just going to make another one. I like it that much. I never knit patterns again, but decided I'm going to do it this time. So look out for that. That may be a whip soon in the future. So the first actual FO I have for the month is my poisoned apple top. So for those of you who were here last month, you know that I was complaining about this a little bit. I lost my knitting mojo, partially because both of the patterns that I was working on were quite complicated and needed a bit of thinking, and because I was worried they wouldn't really fit. So the first one of those that I was talking about was this lovely top here. It's called Poisoned Apple by Lily Kate Makes. It has these gorgeous puff sleeves and also this mohair panel here. So the mohair is mohair silk lace from 3 Cats Yarn, and it is a colorway that she dyed for me custom because I wanted it to match this grey that I had. And the grey is BWM Luxury as well. It was some yarn that I had in stash. Now, when I say that I had it in stash, I mean that I had about a ball and a half of it in stash, which meant that I needed to buy another ball. And I didn't realise until after I had finished and blocked this that the second ball must have been a different enough dye lot that the colours just, you can tell. So, I'm not sure what this is going to look like in camera. In person, it's subtle but obvious. The colour changes somewhere around here. And then also, I didn't even realise that I'd done this, but the sleeves are different colours. So this sleeve matches the main body colour, and this sleeve unfortunately must have come off the ball that was used for this bottom bit here. So that's all a bit unfortunate. I don't know that anyone's going to notice except me, really. I showed my husband yesterday and he looked at it for a sec and he was like, yeah, you can tell, but it's not obvious. Like, he could point out exactly where the colour changed on the body, but only after he looked at it for a while. So I think it'll be okay. It doesn't fit, unfortunately, and it's also the wrong time of year for it. So I sort of just shoved it into my drawer and decided to worry about it later. I did put the waist shaping in that I mentioned that I was going to do, so that turned out nicely. It's this lovely sort of A-line figure right here. And it's just a bit too short and a bit too tight around the tummy. And it's just the wrong time of year for it. I finished it late enough in the year that it's cold and I can't really wear it anymore. So I just sort of put it in my drawer, decided not to think too much about it. And next spring, I'll just it's only a little bit too small right now. So I will probably just try it on again, see how it goes. And if it is still too small, I'll just gift it to a friend maybe. We'll see. But the pattern itself was great. The instructions for how to do everything were really clear and well laid out. And hopefully I can wear this sometime in the future. So the next FO that I have is something that I cast on a bit of a whim. So, going back to last month's podcast for a sec, thank you to everyone who suggested how I could get out of my knitting slump. Sorry I haven't replied to any of the comments yet. I will do that when I upload this video to YouTube. But I just got a bit busy last month. But I did read all your comments. Thank you so much for your suggestions. If anyone is stuck in a bit of a knitting slump, the two main suggestions that I got from quite a few people actually were, 1, work on the thing that you're stuck on for a little bit every day, sort of 30 minutes every day, just to keep the progress going. And then 2, to also cast on something fun so that you have a project to switch to after your 30 minutes are done, just so you have something else that you can be more excited about. So I did do a combination of both of those things throughout the month to get through the poisoned apple top. And this is one of the fun things that I cast on. So this is a pair of couch boots, which is a pattern that I wrote in 2021 for a subscription box company called Knit Crate. They used to send out yarn and then patterns that you can make with the yarn, and so I was a designer for them. They don't operate anymore, but this was a fun thing to write for them at the time. So the yarn is called Mrs. Crosby Wonderlust, I'm pretty sure. I think it's discontinued because I think it might have been a Knit Crate exclusive. But I still had about a skein and a half left from what they had sent me as part of the design process. Now this actually came from the same skein. They're clearly very different colours. So I don't know what happened. I think maybe the yarn just was dyed sort of in different sections. Like, I think part of it must have come from 2 separate skeins, because I did have a skein and a half, but definitely like this came with at least part of this yarn in one skein. So I don't know what happened. Sometimes it's just the fun of working with hand-dyed yarn, I think. Now, the pattern is a fun one. I wanted to make reverse stockinette socks, essentially, but I didn't want to do all that purling. So the way you work these is you cast on actually down here along the bottom of the foot, and you do some magic, you work in the round, you pick up some stitches, and you knit the whole thing in knit stitches, and then you switch to the cuff design here at the top. And then to actually wear it, you turn the whole thing inside out, and you turn the cuff down, and then you've got this cute pair of boots. And I don't like wearing pearl bumps against my feet. So this way it's nice and smooth on the inside, because the stockinette side is on the soles of your feet. So yeah, I really like this pattern. I will post a picture here of what it looks like. This picture is not this pair. The picture's of my feet wearing my version, which I made back in 2021 when I was writing the pattern. And so I made the size smaller, I think. So the pattern is actually custom fit. You measure your foot length and your foot circumference, and then just before you cast on, there's a tiny bit of maths that the pattern like walks you through, just to calculate how many stitches you should be casting on. And so you do that, and you get a sock that fits you perfectly. Now, I wanted to surprise Mum. This was her Mother's Day present, so I didn't get a chance to actually ask her to measure her feet, but I found a sizing chart from like a shoe wear company, and I do know what size shoe she is, so I used that and it worked out really well. They fit her fine, and these boots live in my house because I have tile in my house, and Mum's feet get cold on the tile. So these are her socks for my house. Now, if anyone has suggestions for a good 14-ply yarn that I could knit these in, I would like to rewrite the pattern into my own format and an Australian yarn. And I'm just struggling to find a good 14-ply yarn that I can use. I feel like 12-ply is pretty common these days, but 14 is still a bit of a struggle. Especially something with some nylon in it, because they are socks, so it would be nice to have the nylon content in it. But I will settle for wool, just because it's not like they're socks you're meant to be wearing inside your shoes. They're so thick that, like, good luck wearing these inside your shoes. So it's not like you're going to be rubbing against, like, the soles or the heels of a shoe. So the nylon's not super important, but it would be nice. But I do want to find some variegated yarn, because I feel like this stitch pattern shows off variegation nicely. So if anyone has any suggestions, please let me know, because I would like to rewrite the pattern sometime soon. On to the whips. So, what can I tell you about? The first thing I'll tell you about is my husband's jumper / cardigan. If you've been here for a while, you'll know what I'm talking about, and you'll know why I'm calling it a jumper / cardigan. But for everyone else, I have been knitting Porter, which is a pattern from Hudson & West. It's by Megan Babin. It is a giant cabled, shawl-coloured cardigan, but I'm turning it into a jumper. Last month, I had finished both the sleeves and the back piece, and I hadn't started the front piece. And this month I have finished the front piece. So this was going to be the most complicated part of the knitting process because this was the part that I had to adapt from being a cardigan into being a jumper. I am going to make a standalone video about the process of making this jumper because it has been quite a bit of effort. The yarn is Wool of the Andes worsted from Knit Picks in this beautiful sort of rusty orange colour called Persimmon Heather, and it's knit up really beautifully. It is quite dense, so it's a bit heavy, especially given that they're cables, but it'll be nice and warm for the winter. So I will go into some amount of detail, but not excruciating amounts, because I will save that for the standalone video. So if you are curious about how I adapted this into a jumper, I will put a link to my Ravelry project down below where I gave some details, and when the video is finished, I will share that all with you as well. So essentially what I did was the cardigan pattern had two separate fronts, a left front and a right front, and they were basically just this, except this middle cable was not there. It was just replaced by the button bands. There were some extra nuances to it. The button band was wider than this middle cable panel, which meant that the outside edges of the front pieces in the pattern were narrower to compensate, but I just wanted to be able to follow the pattern for the back part as the bottom half of the front. So I did a little bit of maths and figured out how to adjust the edges and how to reintroduce the cable panel in the middle. And then essentially what I did is I followed the pattern for the back up until the underarms. And then I did the underarm decreases. And then I followed the decrease instructions for the left and right fronts here along the armhole until I got to about this point here. And see here how this line starts bowing out to the sides. So if you looked at the cardigan pattern, one of the nice parts about it was that this sort of slip stitch line continued all the way up the front of the cardigan and then up the front of the neckline, and I wanted to do that too. So I did a bit of fussing and started making it so that I started decreasing into these cable panels and increasing this middle one so I could keep that line consistent. And then when I got to the bottom of the neckline, I just bound off the number of stitches I needed, and at that point these two separate sections, this sort of the right front here and the left front here, it was identical to what was in the pattern for the left and right front. So I just followed the pattern from there. Now I do think that I got some of my maths wrong somewhere, because the number of decreases that it said you should do on the armhole didn't actually end up lining up with what I finally got. I ended up having to add an extra decrease in here somewhere, but it was fine. It worked out fine. The other thing that's a little frustrating about this pattern is that they don't give very clear guidelines about how to decrease into the cables as you go. It gives some guidelines, but not a lot. So I did end up making it up as I went a little bit. I don't begrudge them, because trying to explain how to do a decrease for every possible part of these charts would have been impossible. So you do have to use a little bit of creative license deciding how you decrease into the charts. I ended up doing some funky things here and there, because if I had just decreased exactly how they suggested, there would have been long sections where like some of these lines never crossed. So there were a couple of weird cables where I crossed over the decrease. Like the decrease stitch was part of the cable. Don't ask me exactly how I did it. I just did it. But it's worked out nicely. And so that's all the knitting, except for the collar. That's all the knitting done for this. So I finished this while I was overseas, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later too. But I need to wash and block all the pieces now. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then I'll seam it and then put on the shawl collar, and hopefully it'll fit. I'm worried that it's looking a little bit big because my gauge swatch was measuring small, so I sized up. And I don't know if that was the right choice because now I'm worried that it's too big, but he did say that he wanted more of an oversized fit than a tight one. So hopefully it should be okay. So more on that next month. The last whip that I have is a baby blanket. So I mentioned that I might cast this on at the end of last episode, and I went ahead and did it. So this is the Building Blocks Baby Blanket, which is a pattern that I wrote. I don't know now. It's a pretty old pattern actually. But I really like it. I've always really liked this pattern. It is mosaic knitting, so it's some of the easiest colour work that you can do. And I just love this yarn. So this is Abbey Road Freedom, which is 100% 8-ply cotton. It was a skein that I just saw in Spotlight's sale, and I couldn't help myself because it was too pretty not to pick up. I'm a bit of a sucker for pastel rainbow colours, especially in baby things. And then the contrast colour is called Four Seasons Flinders, also an 8-ply cotton, and it's just in a neutral creamy colour. So I was worried that the design was not going to show up quite as clearly as it does in a solid yarn. So I'll pop a picture up just to show you what it's, air quotes, meant to look like. So as you can see, I have lost some of the detail. So the yellow parts are especially low contrast with the white. And also, this yarn is really strange and interesting in that the colour changes are not consistent lengths. So I found as I go along that the blue and the like peachy colour are sort of medium length, and the green and the yellow are very long, and the purple and the pink are extremely short. So that's why the different sections of colour are all different heights, and also it's much easier to see the pattern in the more solid blocks of colours, which is why I think it's a lot clearer in the blue and the green. But because the pink and the purple are changing so quickly into each other, you lose a bit of the pattern there. And then it is quite frustrating that the yellow is one of the longer colours because it is so low contrast with the white that it's a bit hard to see. But I knew that using variegated yarn for this was going to be a bit of a risk anyway, and I decided to go for it because I thought regardless of whether you can see the pattern or not, it's just going to be pretty. It's just a pretty rainbowy baby blanket, even if you can't see all the detail. So I am loving this as a knit. I'm having so much fun with it. There's something about variegated yarn that it's just so moreish because you just want to see the next colour change. And this pattern, I always forget that it takes me a couple of chart repeats to get it into my head. So it's always a little bit of a struggle at the start because it's not the easiest it's not the easiest knitting to read as you make it, just because it's a little bit busy and so it takes a while to memorize the pattern. But once you get used to reading your knitting, it's really easy from then on. So I think it took me like 2 or 3 blocks of the little like tetra-shaped blocks to get back into the swing of it, but then now it's pretty smooth sailing. I just know what the chart looks like and I've just been knitting away on it. So I'm really glad I had this because it did break up some of the monotony of some of the more difficult projects, and I've been enjoying having something really fun and just easy to work on. So the pattern is written for 10-ply yarn, but this stuff was 8-ply, so I sized down a needle size. So mosaic knitting usually looks a bit better if you work it on a needle size smaller than your standard one. So normally for 8-ply yarn, which is DK for my friends in the States, I would knit on a 4mm needle or a US 6, but I'm knitting this on a 375. which is a size 5. And because it's 8 ply, I didn't do a gauge swatch or anything. I just sort of guessed, and I added an extra 16 stitches, which is 1 full chart repeat, just to make it a little bit wider. It's coming out really nicely. So this is a blanket for my friend whose baby isn't due until August. So I think what I'm going to do is, as much as I'm loving it, I do have some other things that I want to make at the moment that are a little bit more time sensitive. So I only have this much of the first ball left. So I think I'll just finish this off and then put it down for a little while and work on some of the other stuff, which we will talk about at the end of the podcast. And then pick this back up again a bit closer to August when the baby's born. Because I also need to know her name, because I want to put that into the blanket. So that's my current plan for now. And I will talk all about what those knitting plans are at the end of the podcast in my last section. So the next section of my podcast is always Off the Needles, where I talk about life stuff, sometimes knitting related, sometimes not. This month it is a little bit of both. So this is going to come across as a little bit random because I didn't mention it at all last month, but we went to Japan. I think our plans were still a little bit up in the air when I last spoke to you, so I didn't really talk about it, but we went for 11 days. We left in the middle of May and we got back about 4 or 5 days ago. And yeah, it was just so much fun. So we started in Tokyo, stayed there for a couple of nights. Then we caught the train to Takayama, which is a little old school town, sort of somewhere in the middle of the main island. I don't know if they have a main island or if it's the South Island or whatever. But anyway, the island that Tokyo is on. Started in Tokyo, went to Takayama, and then went to Kyoto for quite a few nights, about 3 or 4 nights. And then we caught the train back to Tokyo and stayed there for another night before we flew out. And yeah, it was just heaps of fun. I've had Japan on my bucket list for ages. So part of the fun and one of the downsides of being married into a family from overseas is that you have an inbuilt excuse to travel, but most of that travel is to one place. So it's been a really long time since we've gone somewhere that wasn't the US or Australia when we were living in the US. And so this is the first new country that I visited in a while. And we've been wanting to go for ages. So I'm glad we finally got to go. I really liked how different it was. So yeah, I feel like people have a decent amount, or at least I do, have a decent amount to Japanese culture through like pop culture and stuff. So a lot of it was what I expected, but in a really good way. Like, it was like, oh, here's this thing you've thought about or heard about for a really long time. Isn't it awesome in person? And it was. I think the highlight of my trip was Tokyo. I did really love Tokyo. It's alive in a way that Sydney's not. And I mean that with all love for my hometown. Sydney is very quiet, which is nice because it's quite chill. Good place to raise your kids. But when you go to a city like Tokyo or New York, it's just obvious how much more alive some other places are. They don't have any nice beaches, but they have a lot more stuff going on. So yeah, Tokyo felt a lot like New York in that it just felt like you could do whatever you wanted. If there was something you were into, you'd probably find it there. So visited a couple of board game stores because that's my husband's main hobby and one of mine too. So it's a good shared hobby. And so we picked up a couple of Japanese board games, which we've been playing with Amelia actually. One of them is like a game that you can play with kids. So surprisingly fun, even with a 4-year-old. So it was really cool. And he's also into mini painting, which is like little figurines. He paints them. And so a lot of the board game stores were in the same shops as the mini painting places because they're sort of adjacent hobbies. So he got to see a lot of that stuff too. Amelia's quite into it because she likes paint, so worked out really well. Got to spend a fun couple hours in there. And I did get to do some nitty things, which we'll talk about in a bit. And then also, yeah, the food. Oh my gosh. I've just always thought that I love Japanese food. Like, between Japanese and Italian, it's just, I figured that they were the two foods that I could live off indefinitely if I needed to. It turns out it's not as true as I thought, but the food is still really good. So I don't know that I could live off Japanese food entirely, but I would very happily eat it like 90% of the time. So I find that when I travel, it's really interesting because I feel like countries export like a very small sliver of their cuisines. So, for example, we went on a ramen tour, which was, I can highly recommend. If you're in Tokyo and you like ramen, I'll put a link to it down below, but definitely go on this tour. We booked it through Airbnb, and Shitaro, who was the tour guide, he just it was so much fun. He took us to some really good ramen places and then took us on like a walking tour of the area, and it was one of the highlights of the trip. But ramen's a good example. We ate a chicken ramen and we ate a type of ramen called tsukumen, which is something that I know of, but it's not that common. It's like noodles with a really thick soup next to it, and you like dip it in the soup as opposed to eating a bowl full of soup. And I feel like if you go anywhere in the West, you can get really good ramen, but it's all just like pork in a bowl. So stuff like that, like you just see different things when you go to the country that they're actually from. So I ate a lot of ramen. I'm a convert to chicken ramen now. Ate a lot of good sushi and some udon, and Wes got some curry. I've never been the biggest fan of Japanese curry, but he likes it, so that was good. But then there was just a lot of other stuff that you just don't get over here. Lots of little snacks and sweets and things from the 7-Eleven. Which sounds ridiculous, but the food in the 7-Eleven there is really good. And yeah, it was just a lot of fun. Also, some weirdly good Italian food. Turns out the Japanese people really like Italian food, so there's some really good Italian food just sort of scattered around. So yeah, it was just a nice place to get out and go to. Definitely would go back. Now, the knitting related stuff. So we took the bullet train or the Shinkansen quite a bit because we were hopping around between cities. Although that involves a lot of long train rides. So I think in 11 days, I guess we took about 8 or 9 hours worth of train rides. I got less knitting than you'd expect done, but I did get quite a bit done. So I cast on my building blocks baby blanket on the train. I wanted to be able to center pull the yarn, so I hand wound it on the train into a cake. I was quite proud of myself actually, because normally when I hand wind balls, they end up in these weird little misshapen balls. But I got a very nice cakey looking cake out of this one, so that was pretty cool. I actually put some effort into winding it nicely. The other nitty thing that I did is that I went to Walnut. So there is a popular Japanese knitting magazine called Amarisu. Sorry, just getting my skein of yarn. And they have a chain of local yarn stores called Walnut. So there was one in Tokyo and one in Kyoto. I only went to the one in Tokyo, and it was pretty interesting. I had been hoping to see more Japanese yarn. Like, I didn't see any Noro stocked, which was a bit sad because I wanted to see if I could find some Noro yarn. But most of the brands that were there were things that you would find in a local yarn store, either here or in the States. So there was actually some Circus Tonic, which was really cool. For anyone who doesn't know, Circus Tonic is an Australian indie dyer. But there was a lot of sort of Brooklyn tweed and some La Bien-Aimée, and I don't think they had any Holst, but just like brands you hear about on Western podcasts. And I like buying local yarn when I go overseas. So the one very Japanese brand that I could tell was Japanese was the actual Amaterasu yarn. So they have a line of yarn themselves, and they had, 4 or 5 different bases, but I went ahead and bought a skein of Trek. So it's this beautiful sort of pastel-y rainbow, which I like pastel rainbows. And my plan is to make some socks. I am not a sock knitter. If you've been here for any amount of time, you'll know the only thing that I've ever made approaching socks since I started the podcast is that pair of boots. But something recently has been calling me to make socks because I just want cozy toes. So this is 100% merino, 350 meters to 100 grams. So it's labeled fingering weight, but it feels like maybe it's a bit closer to sport. But I think it might be so dense because the yarn is twisted very tightly. So I checked with the lady in the shop. I asked her if it was okay to use for socks because it is 100% wool. There's no nylon content. And she said yes, it is actually a sock yarn. So they wind it very tightly so it can be a bit hardier. Don't know if that's going to show up, but it's wound quite tightly. It is also quite thin, so I think it is a 4-ply. It's just probably a bit more dense. So I have looked up a couple of sock patterns online. I haven't chosen one yet, but the Discord server that I'm in, which I mentioned last month, is actually running a Japanese knit-along. A lot of people wanted to knit Japanese patterns, and people were talking about them heaps. So we ended up having a knit-along for them, and I hadn't found any patterns that I really liked because a lot of Japanese patterns are these like really beautiful garments, and I'm not in the mood to make a garment at the moment. So I decided that I would pick up a skein of sock yarn and make some socks. I have looked up a couple of patterns that are written for this yarn itself, which is always nice because then you don't have to worry about substituting and stuff. So I will probably make one of them. I don't know. We'll see. I need to go through the list and take a look. But it is probably going to be my next cast on because the cowl only runs till the end of the month. And then the other thing that I picked up is this cute little measuring tape. So I've needed a measuring tape for a long time. And this one's nice because it's retractable and it's floppy and it has inches on one side and centimeters on the other. So I'm quite happy with it. And it's got a little squirrel knitting. So that's lovely. So yeah, that's my knitty related stuff from Japan as well. Okay, the last section of my podcast is always up next, which is where I talk about what my plans are for the next month. So like I mentioned, I will probably cast on some socks, pattern TBC. I will probably put down the Building Blocks baby blanket at the end of this ball. The other thing that I do really need to get to is I have a pattern that I'm writing for a magazine. So if next episode is a bit short, it's because I've probably started and finished an entire FO that I'm not allowed to tell you about. But I will tell you about it in like October. I forget when this issue of the magazine is coming out. But I will tell you about it then. The other thing that I want to cast on is something I need your input on. So I recently got back the rights to a lot of my patterns. So if you are unfamiliar with how designing and stuff works, totally fine. It's not something a lot of people know about. But you can either write your own patterns and publish them yourself, which is like indie pattern designers. And it's most of what you will buy is like individual downloads on Ravelry. Or you can sell patterns to magazines or yarn companies, which is something that I do quite a bit. And in a lot of those cases, after some period of time, you get the rights back. So the magazine or the yarn company will publish it exclusively for some period of time, and then you're allowed to also publish it yourself and sell it on Ravelry as an individual download, as if you had written it just as like an indie design. So I've recently gotten the rights back to a couple of different patterns, and I want to release them myself, which usually means that I will sometimes rework a sample into Australian yarn and then also reformat the pattern so that it looks more like my self-published ones. So it's an already existing pattern, but it does still take some amount of work because a lot of the time you have to retake the photos so that I'm the model, because that's just what I do for my self-published patterns. And then also you have to rewrite things because the style can be different. So there's a bit of work involved. So I have 2 patterns that I'm thinking of doing, and I need your input about whether they're worth doing at all and also which one I should do first. So the first option is this beautiful scarf called Trigonometric. It is knit in 8-ply Polworth by Corolla Down Under. It's single colour brioche, takes 4 skeins of the yarn, and you get this lovely shawl out of it. I've talked about this before, so I don't want to harp on about it too much, but this is the shawl, and I'll try and put up some pictures here. So I don't need to do any knitting for this, and I have actually already retaken the photos, so I just need to rewrite the pattern into my own terms. The other option that I have is the Mossy Mitts, which were a pattern that I wrote for Knit Crate. They were originally published for Malabrigo Dos Tiaras, which is a yarn that still exists. I think you can buy it in Australia, but the colourway was exclusive to Knit Crate. So I did want to support a local indie dyer and rewrite the pattern for her. So I picked this skein of gorgeous yarn up from Mel from 3 Cats Yarn. It's an 8-ply or DK Superwash Merino. The colour is called Green Moon Moth, and it's this lovely sort of variegated speckly green. And the mittens look like this. I don't have the original mittens with me, so I can't show them to you, but I'll show you these pictures. And it's just a really nice pattern for highly variegated yarn. They are really quick. They're fingerless mitts. I think I can knit one up in like 3 hours, so it's not a big project. You could, if I published it, you could have them very happily for 2/3 of this winter. So these are the 2 patterns I'm thinking of self-publishing first out of my long list of things that I want to self-publish. But I wanted to check with you guys, would you knit these, and which one do you want me to publish first? That's my question to you. So if you could pop a comment down below, I would love to know, because it's really nice getting feedback and knowing that I'm not just sort of like publishing into the void. And I'd like to actually make something that people would like, especially for this winter. So let me know which one you think I should get to first, and I will try and publish it in the next month or so. So I think that's the whole episode. If you've been here for the whole episode, thank you very much. Sorry if it's been a bit choppy, but I've been having some issues with my camera battery. So that's why, if things have been a bit stoppy-starty, that's what's been going on. But I'm really glad that you're here, as always. If you have stuck around this long, please pop a like down below. It really helps YouTube to know the people are watching and recommend it to more people. And if you are new, then you can subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any updates. There is a subscribe button down below, or a big subscribe button right here. And if you want to catch up on previous episodes, there's a playlist of all of them down here. But other than that, I've been Kat from Oliphant Cat, and I will see you next month. Happy knitting!